Today we're going to rank the main military rifle of 10 countries, worst to best. The bottom of this board is a rifle a country carried into a war it lost. The top of it is a rifle 70 other countries decided they wanted too. Over 7 million of one rifle on this board have been built. 7 million. That's more than any other rifle on any other list I've ever put together. And the country that made it, a country that in 1945 wasn't allowed to make rifles at all, put it into service in 1959. I'll get there. D tier, worst tier, the rifles the war outgrew. Rank 10, Zastava M70, Yugoslavia. We start at the bottom. D tier, worst tier, the rifles the war outgrew. Rank 10, the Zastava M70, Yugoslavia. Developed in the late 1960s, adopted as the standard rifle of the Yugoslav People's Army through the 1970s, and carried by every side of the wars that broke the country apart in the 1990s. Kalashnikov pattern, long stroke piston, gas rod pushes the bolt. 30-round curved magazine, chambered in 7.62 by 39. A rifle you have already seen 1,000 times without knowing its name. Here's the number. The M70 weighs about 3.7 kilos unloaded. That is roughly 600 grams heavier than the AKM it copied. The reason is bolted onto the muzzle. It's a grenade launching sight, folded down against the barrel, a flip-up ladder that raises for firing rifle grenades off the muzzle. Yugoslav doctrine treated the rifle grenade as core infantry equipment, so every rifle carried the hardware for it. 600 grams, doesn't sound like much. Multiply it across a squad of 9 men over a 20-kilometer movement in the hills of Bosnia. That is a man's worth of extra weight walking uphill in wool trousers and canvas boots. And the verdict is this. The M70 is a competent rifle strapped to an obsolete idea. By the 1990s, nobody was launching rifle grenades off muzzles anymore. The rest of Europe had moved to 5.56 with underslung grenade launchers, and Yugoslavia had a heavier rifle designed to do a job the tactics no longer asked for. It was reliable, it fired, it killed, but it was the oldest design any European army was still carrying into general issue when the shooting started in Vukovar in 1991. Not because it was bad, because it belonged to a doctrine that had aged out from under it. What it cost the men who carried it was weight. Weight for a capability they weren't using. Weight for a war their neighbors were fighting with lighter, faster, more accurate rifles. And when the country dissolved and every faction inherited the same rifle from the same factory, the M70 stopped being a national rifle at all. It became briefly everybody's rifle. And the man across the river was carrying it too. Bottom of the board, C tier, dated tier, the ones that answered the last war. Rank 9, the AKM, Soviet Union, 1959. Not the AK-47 you're picturing, the AKM, the stamped receiver, mass production version that replaced the milled AK-47 and became the actual rifle the Soviet Union built by the millions. Mikhail Kalashnikov designed it. Long stroke piston, rotating bolt, 7.62 by 39. The reason every American shooter thinks he knows what an AK looks like. Somebody made a tier list about this once and everybody's been copying it since. It usually puts the AKM at the top. Here is the number that doesn't. Effective range, 300 to 400 meters. That is the doctrinal figure. The AKM was designed for a war fought at 300 meters or less, from the shoulder or the hip, by conscripts who might have 3 weeks of training. Compare that to the 7.62 NATO rifles it was contemporary with. The FAL, effective to 600. The G3, the same. That is a 200-meter gap in reach. 200 meters is the difference between shooting first and being shot first. The verdict is that the AKM is the rifle equivalent of the Soviet soldier himself. Simple, tough, produced in numbers nobody else could match, and asked to do exactly one thing extremely well. It was the right rifle for the Warsaw Pact, and it was the wrong rifle for the next war. When NATO went to 5.56 in the 1970s and 80s, the Soviets followed with the AK-74, because the AKM's reach and its recoil and its cartridge weight were already the wrong answer. 10 million produced worldwide, depending on which figure you trust. But it does not put it in the top tier. What it bought its men was that they didn't have to think. The rifle fired in mud, in dust, dropped in a stream, kicked out of a truck. What it cost them was reach and precision. If the man across the field had a rifle designed 20 years later, he shot you before you knew he was there. And that happened in every war the AKM went to after 1979. A rifle that answered the last question. Still C tier. Rank 8, the AK-74, Soviet Union, adopted in 1974. Kalashnikov's answer to the M16. Same pattern as the AKM, long stroke piston, rotating bolt, stamped receiver, but rebuilt for a new cartridge, 5.45 by 39. A small, high-velocity round designed to match what the Americans had done with 5.56 a decade earlier. The rifle the Soviet Army carried into Afghanistan in 1979 and out of it in 1989. The measurement that matters here is muzzle velocity. The 5.45 round leaves the AK-74 barrel at about 900 meters per second. The 7.62 round from an AKM leaves at 715. That is a flatter trajectory, a lighter cartridge, and about twice as many rounds carried for the same weight in a man's chest rig. The physical picture. An AKM soldier carries roughly 180 rounds in 6 magazines. An AK-74 soldier carries the same weight and holds 300 rounds. That is not a small upgrade. That is 30 seconds of extra fire he can put down before he has to think about resupply. And yet, the verdict is that the AK-74 is a copy of a decision the Americans made first. The Soviets watched what happened in Vietnam, watched what a light, fast, small caliber round did to infantry doctrine, and copied it. Well, competently, but 10 years late, and the rifle inherited every quirk of the AK layout. The safety lever that clacks, the sights set for a war fought at 300 meters, the ergonomics designed for a soldier in mittens, into an era when its rivals were being built ergonomically from scratch. It is a better AKM. It is not a better M16. What it bought the men in Afghanistan was carry weight. What it cost them was that the mujahideen they were fighting captured them, used them, and turned them around in weeks. A rifle designed for a war of maneuver in Europe got sent into mountains against irregulars, and the doctrinal advantage the cartridge was supposed to buy never showed up. The math never favored them again. B tier, workhorse tier, the honest middle. Rank 7, the FNFAL, Belgium, 1950s, Fusil Automatique Léger, light automatic rifle, which is French for, we're going to call it light, and it will not be light. Designed by Dieudonné Save at Fabrique Nationale in Herstal, 7.62 NATO, 20-round magazine, gas-operated with a tilting bolt, a breech lock that rocks on a pin. The rifle the free world was supposed to standardize on, and mostly did. Picture this. It's 1965. You're a Belgian conscript on the North German plain. The magazine holds 20. The rifle weighs 4.5 kilos. You're expected to hit a man at 400 meters, standing up, in wool. That's the FAL. Over 2 million produced, adopted by more than 90 countries. The British called theirs the L1A1 and made it semi-auto only because they thought conscripts couldn't be trusted with full auto on a 7.62. I repeated this myself for years before I read the actual file that the FAL lost to the G3 in NATO trials. It didn't. Different countries made different choices, and Germany chose Heckler and Koch. The verdict on the FAL is that it is a magnificently competent rifle that arrived at the exact moment the argument it was built to win became irrelevant. 600-meter reach, semi-auto precision, everything a battle rifle was supposed to have. And then Vietnam happened, and everybody realized the average soldier was not shooting anybody at 600 meters and never had been. The FAL is what you build if you take doctrine seriously. It ranks here, not higher, because the doctrine was wrong. My brother will tell you how it shoots. I'm going to tell you what it did. What it bought the men who carried it was accuracy. Real, unimpeachable accuracy at range. What it cost them was weight and a magazine you emptied faster than you wanted to. In Rhodesia, in the Falklands, in the Congo, wherever a soldier had to walk a long distance and shoot a man at unknown range with iron sights, the FAL did its job. A perfect answer to the wrong question. Still B tier. Rank 6, the SIG SG550, Switzerland. In Swiss service, it's called the STGW-90, Sturmgewehr 90, assault rifle model 1990. Adopted in the 1980s to replace the STGW-57. Long stroke piston, rotating bolt, 5.56 NATO, 20 and 30 round translucent polymer magazines. made by SIG in Neuhausen. The rifle every Swiss militiaman kept at home for decades under a system that treated the citizen and the soldier as the same person. The measurement that decides this placement is accuracy. The SG550 is one of the most accurate service rifles ever adopted by a national army. Factory-tested groupings at 300 meters are consistently tighter than what the FAL or the M16 produce at the same range with the same ammunition. Why? Because Switzerland doesn't fight wars. Switzerland trains its army to hit targets at known distances in shooting matches. The rifle was built for a country whose entire military doctrine is defensive marksmanship. The barrel is heavier, the tolerances are tighter. The rifle weighs 4.1 kilos, heavier than an M16A2 by about 700 grams, and every one of those grams is barrel and receiver. The verdict is that the SG550 is a beautifully made rifle for a country that has designed its army around never fighting. It is the most accurate 5.56 service rifle on this board. It is also the heaviest, and it belongs to a doctrine that no other country on this list operates under. A Swiss militiaman fires his rifle at paper targets in a range shed built by his canton. That is a different job description than a rifle carried into Fallujah. The SG550 is what happens when a rifle answers a national temperament, not a combat requirement. What it bought its men was pride, ownership. The rifle went home with the soldier, sat in the closet, came out for the range weekends. It made a citizen army feel like an army. What it cost was that if Switzerland ever actually had to use it in the way rifles are usually used, the heavy barrel and the tight tolerances would be a liability, not an asset. That's a different category of soldier. Rank 5. The HK416, Germany. Developed at Heckler and Koch and adopted across NATO Special Forces from the mid-2000s onward. Adopted by the French Army in 2016 as the HK416F, replacing the FAMAS as France's standard service rifle. 5.56 NATO, 30-round Stanag magazines, NATO standard detachable box. Short-stroke gas piston, a rod taps the bolt. Barrel lengths ranging from 280 millimeters for the compact to 508 for the rifle length variant. Here's what the HK416 actually is, stated flat. It is an M16 with a gas piston. Heckler & Koch took Eugene Stoner's rotating bolt lower and married it to a European short-stroke gas piston and sold it to every Special Forces unit that had grown tired of cleaning direct impingement carbon out of a bolt carrier. The number that matters. The DevGru team that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in 2011 was carrying HK416s. Every operator on that stack. That is not doctrine. That is a procurement decision made by men who spend their working lives shooting people at close range and will not carry a rifle that jams. The verdict is that the HK416 is the rifle you buy when the base rifle is basically right and you want the last 10%. It is not a fundamentally new design. It is a maintenance load reduction of an already excellent design, and that ranks it where it ranks. High because it works, but not at the top because it is derivative of two rifles further up this board. France adopted it because their own domestic FAMAS was aging out and they were tired of manufacturing an obsolete bullpup. The 416 is what a general staff buys when they've made peace with buying German. What it bought the men who carry it is fewer stoppages and less cleaning at the end of a mission. What it cost was that half of Europe now depends on a rifle whose supply chain runs through one factory in one country in the middle of the continent. If Oberndorf ever stops shipping, half of NATO Special Operations has a problem. Let that sit with you. A tier, the strong ones, rank 4. The Daewoo K2, South Korea. Adopted 1984 by the Republic of Korea Armed Forces. Still their main service rifle today. Designed to replace the M16A1s the Americans had been supplying since the Korean War. 5.56 NATO, folding stock, long-stroke gas piston, rotating bolt, Stanag-compatible magazines. Made in South Korea, by Koreans, for the Korean Peninsula. And this is a country that still has a war on. Here are the numbers, and pay attention because this rifle is a masterpiece of measured trade-offs. Empty weight, 3.26 kilos. Overall length, 970 millimeters, dropping to 730 with the stock folded. Barrel length, 465 millimeters. Muzzle velocity, 920 meters per second with the domestic K100 round. Cyclic rate, 700 to 900 rounds per minute. Compare that folded length to the M16 it replaced. The M16 doesn't fold. 986 millimeters, always. The K2 goes into a Korean armored vehicle, into a tunnel, into a chopper door with 250 millimeters to spare. The verdict is that the K2 is what happens when a country that actually expects to fight designs its own rifle. Korea did not have the luxury of picking the second best answer. They took the M16 lower and the AK's long stroke piston and combined them into a rifle that keeps the Stanag magazine logistics of NATO and the operating reliability of the Soviet system. Effective range: 600 meters with K100 ammunition. That is FAL level reach out of a rifle that weighs a kilo less. The K2 ranks here because South Korea will not accept anything less than a rifle that works. What it buys the men who carry it is that they trust the rifle. Every ROK Army conscript trains on this rifle, knowing it was built by the same country that will send him north if the shooting starts. What it cost was development time and the willingness to design an indigenous rifle when buying American would have been easier. Korea chose harder, a rifle designed by a country that has to mean it. Still A tier. Rank 3, the HS product VHS-2, Croatia. Adopted around 2013 by the Croatian Armed Forces as the primary service rifle. Bullpup layout, magazine behind the trigger, 5.56 NATO. Stanag compatible lower, so it eats M16 magazines. Gas operated, short stroke piston, rotating bolt. Made by HS Product in Karlovac, the same company that makes the pistol some of you are carrying right now under a different name. Here is what makes the VHS-2 remarkable, and I read this number twice before I believed it. Overall length, about 740 millimeters. Barrel length, 500 millimeters. That is a full 19.5-inch barrel, which is more barrel than an M16A2 carries, packaged into a rifle nearly 250 millimeters shorter than the M16. Weight, 3.2 kilos unloaded. The bullpup does that. Put the action behind the trigger, and you keep the barrel long enough to give the 5.56 round its full muzzle velocity, without the rifle sticking out past a soldier's elbow when he's climbing out of a Bradley. The verdict on the VHS-2 is that it is the best rifle nobody outside of Croatia has heard of. It ranks this high because it does something almost no other rifle on this board does. It gets full 5.56 ballistic performance out of a package the length of a submachine gun. The French tested it, liked it, and ordered a variant. That is a country that could have bought anything on earth buying a rifle from Croatia. A country that in 1991 was fighting for its existence with borrowed AKs is now selling its own rifle to the French army. That's the story. What it bought the men who carry it is confidence. A Croatian soldier carries a rifle designed and built in his own country, in a factory an hour from his barracks. What it cost was that a bullpup has quirks. The trigger pull is a linkage. The magazine change is behind the shooting hand. Ergonomics that reward training and punish improvisation. That's what it looks like when a small country builds its own. S tier, the top of the board. Rank 2, the M16, United States. Designed by Eugene Stoner at Armalite as the AR-15. Adopted by the U.S. Air Force in the early 1960s. Adopted by the U.S. Army as the XM16E1 in 1964, and standardized as the M16A1, rebuilt as the M16A2, and adopted by the Marine Corps in 1983, the Army in 1986. 5.56 NATO. Direct impingement gas system. Gas blows on the bolt. Rotating bolt. The rifle that changed what a rifle was for. Picture this. It's 1967. You're an American rifleman in the Ya Drang. The rifle in your hands weighs 3.1 kilos. The rifle the man across from you is carrying weighs 3.3, and your rifle won't fire because the chamber is fouled and nobody sent you a cleaning kit. You've heard a number for this. It's not the real one. The M16 didn't fail in Vietnam because it was a bad rifle. It failed because the Army swapped the powder in the cartridges to one that fouled harder, and General William Westmoreland's staff shipped rifles without cleaning kits, telling the men the rifle was self-cleaning. It wasn't. Men died. The verdict on the M16 is that it is the most influential rifle since the Kalashnikov and possibly since Mauser. Roughly 8 million M16 family rifles built by the early 2000s. It set the entire template of the modern service rifle. Small caliber, high velocity, controllable automatic, lightweight, magazine fed from a detachable box. Every rifle above it on this board and most of the rifles below it are answers to the question the M16 asked. It ranks second, not first, because the rifle that beat it did so on the ground the M16 chose. The M16 wrote the rules. The rifle above it played them better. What it bought the men who carried it was volume of fire, low recoil, and ammunition weight low enough to carry twice as many rounds as a 7.62 rifleman. What it cost the men who first carried it into Vietnam was their lives, because the institution that adopted it lied about how much maintenance it needed. Somebody had to carry that. S tier, top of the board, rank 1. The Heckler & Koch G3, Germany. Adopted by the Bundeswehr in 1959, 14 years after the Federal Republic of Germany was legally allowed to have an army again. Designed by 3 engineers, Edmund Heckler, Theodore Koch, and Alex Seidel, who took the roller-delayed blowback system, cam rollers slow the bolt, developed at Mauser at the end of the Second World War, watched it become the Spanish set-me rifle, and brought it home to build a rifle for a country that no longer existed when they started designing it. The numbers: 7.62 NATO, 20-round detachable magazine, barrel 450 millimeters, overall length 1,025 millimeters, weight 4.4 kilos unloaded, heavier than the M16A2 by a full kilo, cyclic rate 500 to 600 rounds per minute, deliberately lower than its contemporaries because a slower cyclic rate on a 7.62 rifle means more controllable bursts. And now the number that puts it here: over 7 million rifles built, exported to more than 70 countries, manufactured under license in Iran, Pakistan, Portugal, Turkey, Greece, Saudi Arabia, Norway, Sweden. The AKM was made by one Soviet system. The M16 was made by one American system. The G3 was made by everybody who could afford a factory. The verdict is that the G3 is the most produced Western battle rifle of the 20th century, and it did what no other rifle on this board did. It made itself national infrastructure in 70 other countries. When a country in the 1960s or 1970s decided it wanted a domestic rifle industry, it bought the G3 license. Not the FAL, not the M16. The G3. Because the roller-delayed system is cheaper to mass-produce than gas-operated, because the stamped receiver forgives sloppy factories, and because Heckler & Koch sold the tooling with the rifle. That is the rifle at the top of this board. Not because it is the most refined, because it made itself unavoidable. What it bought the men who carried it, the Bundeswehr conscript on the Fulda Gap, the Portuguese soldier in Angola, the Iranian in the Iran-Iraq War, the Pakistani on the line of control, the Norwegian in the Arctic, was a rifle that fired. In cold, in wet, in dust. It had a heavy trigger and a punishing recoil, and a magazine that ran dry faster than anybody wanted. But it fired, and it kept firing, in 70 different climates on 4 continents for 60 years. 70 countries and 7 million rifles. That's not opinion, that's arithmetic. And the honest version is this. The 7 million figure carries a range. One count puts it closer to 7.5 million, including all licensed production. Another puts it under 6 million if you count only Heckler & Koch marked rifles. Nobody has ever reconciled them. That is where the file stops. Tell me which placement I got wrong. Not which one you don't like, which one you can beat me on, and with what. If you think the K2 belongs above the M16, I want to hear the number that puts it there. There's another board like this one sitting in the same set of records, the main service pistol of each country, and the bottom of it is worse than anything you saw today. History's better than they made it sound. See you next time.